This is a tutorial about how to use my book, The Roses in My Carpets, in your classroom. It's specially used by a lot of teachers for Remembrance Day ceremonies. A lot of the times these days it's harder to get kids engaged in Remembrance Day ceremonies because Remembrance Day was so long ago, World War II was so long ago, and so many of the veterans are dying. But by reading The Roses in My Carpets, they get an idea of war from the sense of the people who are experiencing it. This story is based on a true story. It's based on the story of my Afghan refugee foster child. I got a chance to meet him in 1991-92. I went back to Pakistan for about 3 weeks. I was born there, but I never saw it. And I took a trip up to Peshawar, where my foster child and his family were staying in a refugee camp there. And I got a chance to meet him. And I wrote this story based on that meeting. So it's based on a true story. Now, in terms of this was my second book, but it's still actually one of my favorites. I do a whole presentation on this book. It takes me an hour just to talk about the creation of this book. And that presentation that I talk about in the Roses in My Carpets, it involves like social studies curriculum, because I talk about the mud houses that they live in, the way that they live. It talks about creativity. It talks about, oh gosh, you name it. There's so much in there. You should look at the curriculum applications at the end of the teacher guide. And you'll see like a list of applications about 3 pages long. It's one of my most popular presentations. Now, in terms of teaching the book, there's so many things that you can do with it. For one thing, the basic rule of writing is show, don't tell. And this is a perfect example of that process, because the boy is desperately poor. He's a refugee. But not once in the whole book does the word poor ever come up. So instead of saying that he is poor, I showed that he's poor. I didn't tell, I showed. I showed, don't tell. And the way you can tell that he's poor is the fact that he lives in a refugee camp. He lives in a mud house. The food is so scarce. He has like bread and tea for breakfast. Okay, for them in the morning he has bread and tea for breakfast, and he's glad that his sister's not awake because he can eat it in peace. And then at lunchtime, he breaks his bread into little pieces to make it last longer. And that's what he says, to make it last longer. But his sister, she wolfs down hers. And she wolfs down hers, and then she looks at his. And then he ends up giving her, even though his mother says, no, don't give her any, she had her share. He ends up giving her some of his bread. Because he feels sorry for her, and then he just pulls his sash tighter. Basically, he tightens his belt so he doesn't feel the hunger pains so much. Basically, this story has 3 different problems in it. Like usually a short story would only have 1 problem, but this is actually a very complex story. It has 3 different problems in it. The first problem of the story is the nightmares. Okay, because every night when this boy goes to sleep, he dreams of the jets that were bombing the country. So he dreams of the jets. So that's one of the problems in the story. I often workshop this book with students, and especially for story structure, because a lot of children, they don't understand that, hey, when you say beginning, middle, and end, they think, hey, you know, if they've written a story, it has a beginning, a middle, and end, because it starts on page 1, maybe the middle is page 2 and 3, and the end is page 4. That's what they think, but that's actually not the way it works. It actually has a structural a piece to each beginning, middle, and end. The beginning, basically, you need the characters, you need the problem, you need the setting. And any problem in the story that doesn't get solved is actually kind of part of the setting. When I'm workshopping the story with kids, I ask them, okay, what are the problems of the story? And a lot of the time they'll say, oh, that the father died. And I say, okay, this is not a zombie book. Do you think I can bring the father back? Can I solve that problem? And they say, oh, no, I can't. So then the fact that the father died is actually part of the setting. And then they say, oh, well, the problem is he's so poor. And I said, no, but the thing is he's still poor at the end. That's another thing that doesn't get solved. That's part of the setting. So sometimes the setting is very complicated. In this book, the beginning of the story is actually almost half the book. It goes all the way, because once you've know all 3 of the problems, you're at almost half the book. This is where you hear the last problem. The second problem in the book is the fact that he kind of resents his mother and sister at the beginning of the story, because in his nightmare, it shows up in his nightmare, because in this on this page, he says my mother and sister weigh me down, they hold me back. So that's how he feels, that he's dragging them, trying to find a safe place, and they're holding him back. So he actually feels that way towards them. And then on this page, this is like almost the middle of the book, the third problem shows up. And the third problem is actually his attitude towards being sponsored. Okay, this is a boy who has a lot of pride. He doesn't want to be sponsored because he feels it would have disappointed his father. His father died while he was plowing the field in Afghanistan, and he feels that his father would never have taken aid from a sponsor. So he feels that he's compromising his principles in taking aid. This is actually a story about a boy who desperately needs help, but he doesn't want it. Now, how these three issues get resolved, very soon after this, like he's talking about the carpet weaving, because he sees the carpet weaving as his ticket to independence and his ticket to being able to fulfill his principles of not taking aid, because, like nobody wants to take charity. So then at this point, this is where the point where he hears the boy comes running in and tells him that his sister was hit by a truck. By the way, that actually happened. My foster child's sister was hit by a truck when she was about 4 years old. Her job every day was to go out and look for firewood. And that's how she got hit by the truck. So he gets up, he runs towards the clinic to see if she's okay. And his mother is there, and she's going crazy. So he has to take on the father's mantle, and he has to calm her down, and he tells her to go home and pray for Maha's safety. And when there's news, he'll come. So basically, it's kind of him also taking on his father's role of being responsible for the family. Then after this, he's waiting, and then while he's waiting, he prays. He prays for his mother and his sister, and then he prays for the sponsor who paid for the operation but didn't know it. By the way, I was a sponsor, okay? So I'm not sure if he ever prayed for me, but that's what I put in the story. And by praying for the sponsor, you've seen that he's actually changed his whole attitude about being sponsored. At this point, he realizes that without the sponsor's money, his sister's legs would not have been able to be fixed, but through the operation. So he's grateful for that. So that's the beginning of the end. So the middle of this story is like about 2 pages, okay? The 2 pages is like the middle. It's where things are getting worse. And that's what I always tell kids, is at the beginning of the story, you've got your characters, you've got your setting, you've got your problems. Okay, and this one, problems. It's plural. But the middle of the story, the problem always has to get worse. If the problem doesn't get worse, it means it's a lousy story. So here, the middle of the story is basically his sister being hit by the truck. That's the problem getting worse, in that he was resentful of his sister. He was resentful of his mother because they're taking some of the resources. His sister's always bugging him about the bread and everything like that. So he's got a bit resentful of them, but then he almost loses her. And then sometimes it takes almost losing someone to really appreciate them. And then you see that the problems are getting solved. Here, he has prayed for his mother, he's prayed for his sister. And by the end of the story, like here, in this page, basically what happens is the whole motif of the bread, it comes full circle, because his sister's not there. So that night his mother breaks the bread into 3 pieces, but before she forgets, she has forgotten that there's only 2 of them. So she gives him Maha's share. So he actually gets her share that he had given her earlier, and he gets it back. And he can't enjoy it. So he actually takes it, he splits it in half and gives back half to his mother. And then he says, every bite sticks in my throat, no amount of water helps. So he can't even enjoy the bread that he's getting because he misses his sister so much. And then at the end, he's exhausted and he's going back to sleep. It's basically one day in his life. And the last page is where you know that all of the problems have been solved. Because again, he's dreaming the nightmare. Only this time the nightmare has changed, because there's a space the size of a carpet where the bombs cannot touch them. And in that space, there are roses. This is basically represents his own ability and the hope that he has for the future. It's also the keen yearning for aesthetics in a person's life, because he's got a very mundane brown life. And the carpet, his carpet represents his hopes and his dreams and his yearning for beauty. Everybody has a yearning for aesthetic beauty in their lives. It also represents heaven, and the flowers represent the martyrs, and there's a whole bunch of symbolism in that carpet. But basically that's what it comes. And then in the last page also, you know that the problem has been solved because his mother and sister are running with him. They do not hold him back. And he has realized by the end of the story how much he needs them to. Now, the thing is, a lot of people would, sometimes I think teachers, they underestimate their students. And one of the things that has often surprised me is that when I would go into very difficult schools, and I've been into some of the, probably some of the worst schools in Canada, and even some in the States and stuff, basically they would think that a kid would not be able to pick up a lot of the nuances of a book like this. But what I found surprising was that when I started reading this book to students, sometimes these are really tough kids, they, no matter how tough they were, they would actually respond to the story, and it kind of reaches them on a pretty deep level. And it's been surprising to me. I thought it would be a harder sell, but actually I was surprised that it wasn't. I mean, it's my second book. It was published in 1998. It's still in print. Oh, by the way, it also won an international literary award named after a Jewish author from World War II in Poland. Okay, his name was Janusz Korczak. And if you don't know anything about Janusz Korczak, you should look him up. He's got a fantastic story, way ahead of his time. Basically, he was a Jewish children's writer from World War II, and he used to write these books that were really popular in Europe. Now, what happened was when the Nazis invaded Poland, they rounded up all the Jewish people, and they were sending them to concentration camps. But when they found out that this guy was Janusz Korczak, they said, oh, we can't send you there. We love your books. That's the power of story. And so what they did was they were free. They were going to let him go. But he said, well, what's going to happen to the children in my orphanage? Can I take them with me? And the Nazis said, no, those children, they have to go to the concentration camp. And he said, well, I can't leave them. So he went with those children to a place called Treblinka, and that's where all of them were killed. Now, he was such a hero that the Polish Ministry of Culture, they named this award in his honor. And every 2 years, they'd give this award to 6 books in the world with humanitarian themes, and mine was one of them. It was a real honor to receive this award, especially when I found out about his story. But I also thought it was kind of ironic because here I am, a Muslim woman, and I won an award named after a Jewish guy. Okay, it doesn't happen very often. Okay, I hope you will find the book very helpful in your classroom. I think it's a good way of expanding your students' horizons. Thank you.